On a brisk autumn morning in Arlington, a woman sauntered toward the tomb of the unknown soldier, phone in hand. Her loud laughter pierced the solemn air as she snapped selfies, mocking the silent sentinels who guarded the sacred site. A hush fell over the gathered crowd, their disapproval heavy in the air. She remained oblivious until a firm voice broke through her careless banter. Turning, she found herself face to face with a man in full uniform, his eyes steeled with quiet fury. Elizabeth Connelly stepped onto the manicured grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, her camera slung over her shoulder. A self-proclaimed influencer with thousands of followers, she prided herself on being bold and unconventional. The cemetery, she thought, would make for a dramatic backdrop. She barely glanced at the entrance sign requesting silence and respect, brushing it off as yet another rule meant to be ignored. The morning was brisk, the air crisp with autumn's chill, and Elizabeth wore a fashionable coat that hugged her figure perfectly. She adjusted her sunglasses, giving a quick glance at the endless rows of white headstones. To her, they were symmetrical props, not sacred markers of lives lost. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another notification, another like. It was addictive, and she relished the attention. Walking deeper into the cemetery, she muttered, "This place has such a vibe, as though it were an art exhibit rather than hallowed ground." People moved around her quietly, their heads bowed, some holding flowers, others lost in thought. Elizabeth noticed their somber faces, but shrugged it off. "Too depressing," she whispered under her breath. Her destination was clear: the tomb of the unknown soldier. She had heard about it in passing, a memorial to soldiers who had never been identified. The significance was lost on her. To Elizabeth, it was another must-see spot to check off her list. She passed groups of tourists and mourners, ignoring their looks of disapproval as she chatted loudly on her phone. The atmosphere shifted as she approached the tomb. A solitary guard walked the mat in precise movements, his face a mask of discipline and reverence. The rhythmic clicks of his polished shoes on the stone echoed in the stillness. Elizabeth paused, not out of respect but to get the right angle for her photos. "Perfect lighting," she murmured, raising her camera. She positioned herself near the tomb, angling her body just so, her long hair cascading down one shoulder. Snap after snap, she grinned, tilting her head playfully. The solemn guard continued his watch, unfazed by her antics. As she reviewed the photos on her camera, a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "These are too boring," she said aloud, her voice carrying. "I need something edgy." With that, she stepped closer to the tomb, her boots clicking against the stone. Ignoring the signs urging visitors to maintain a respectful distance, she struck a pose, her back to the grave. "Hey, can you believe this?" a voice from the crowd whispered. "Unbelievable." Another added, "Someone should say something." But Elizabeth remained oblivious, lost in her pursuit of social media perfection. She waved to a passerby, a man in his 60s wearing a weathered military jacket. "Excuse me, could you take a picture of me?" she asked brightly, holding out her phone. The man stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and disappointment. Without a word, he walked away. Elizabeth rolled her eyes. "Rude much?" she muttered. She glanced around, spotting another potential photographer, a young woman holding a toddler. But before she could approach, a hand landed lightly on her shoulder. The touch was firm, but not aggressive. Startled, Elizabeth turned to find herself face to face with a tall man in uniform. His gaze was calm but piercing, his presence commanding in a way that made her falter. "Ma'am," he said in a low, steady voice, "do you know where you are?" Elizabeth blinked, taken aback by his question. "Of course," she replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm at the tomb of the unknown soldier. I was just—" "Disrespecting it," the man interrupted, his tone still measured but sharper now. "This isn't just a backdrop for your pictures. It's sacred ground." For the first time, Elizabeth felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on her. The murmurs had stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. She glanced around, realizing how many people had been watching her. "Look, I didn't mean any harm," she said defensively. "I was just—" "It's not about what you meant," the man said. "It's about what you're doing." His gaze didn't waver. "Do you have any idea what this tomb represents? Whose sacrifice you're standing on?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her fingers tightened around her phone as a wave of unease washed over her. The man's uniform bore medals and insignias she couldn't decipher, but his authority was unmistakable. The crowd watched, waiting to see how she would respond. In that moment, Elizabeth felt an unfamiliar sensation: shame. She looked back at the tomb, the pristine marble glowing in the morning light, and then at the man who stood before her. For the first time that day, she hesitated. For the first time, she felt small. Elizabeth stood frozen, her breath catching as the man in uniform continued to look at her. His words hung heavy in the air, echoing in her mind. "Do you know where you are?" For the first time, she truly looked at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The immaculate marble, the eternal flame, and the soldier marching in solemn rhythm. All of it seemed to hold a weight she had ignored. The guard's precision caught her eye. His movements were deliberate, his steps measured to perfection. Elizabeth noticed how the crowd's attention wasn't on her anymore but on the ceremony unfolding before them. Her cheeks burned as whispers around her continued. She could feel the judgment, sharper than she was used to. The man, still standing before her, gestured to the side of the tomb. "Step away, please," he said firmly. His tone wasn't cruel, but it left no room for argument. Elizabeth obeyed, her heels clicking against the stone as she moved to the sidelines. She fidgeted with her phone, unsure of what to do next. For someone who thrived on attention, she suddenly wanted to disappear. The man in uniform didn't follow her but remained nearby, his eyes scanning the area. Others whispered and glanced at her before turning back to the ceremony. As the soldier continued his ritual, Elizabeth's mind raced. She couldn't stop replaying the man's question. Did she know where she was? She thought she had known. A famous site, a place to get great photos, but the way he had said it made her realize she didn't know at all. The ceremony ended, and the gathered crowd slowly began to disperse. Elizabeth felt a pang of relief as fewer people lingered, but she also felt a new weight in the air, a heaviness she couldn't quite name. Before she could think too much, Staff Sergeant Cole approached her again. "Ma'am," he said, his tone softer now but still firm. "You're not the first to make this mistake, but I hope you'll be the last." "I didn't mean—" Elizabeth started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "It's not about what you meant," he said. "It's about understanding why this place matters." For the first time, Elizabeth found herself at a loss for words. She looked down at her phone, the screen still lit up with notifications from the photos she had already taken. She swiped them away, feeling a strange sense of guilt she couldn't shake. Cole continued. "Do you know what the tomb of the unknown soldier represents? It's not just a memorial. It's a promise, one made to those who gave their lives and were never identified. It's our way of saying we won't forget them, no matter what." Elizabeth nodded, though she felt her throat tighten. She thought of the tombstones she had walked past without a second glance. All those lives, each one a story. And here she was, treating it all like a backdrop for her own ego. Cole's gaze softened slightly as he watched her expression shift. "I'll leave you to think about that," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Elizabeth standing alone. She stood there for a long time, her phone forgotten in her hand. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the marble. For the first time, she didn't think about angles or lighting. She thought about the silence, the stories left untold, and the sacrifices made by people she would never know. Elizabeth stood rooted in place, her emotions a chaotic tangle of embarrassment, guilt, and anger. She couldn't shake the feeling that Staff Sergeant Cole had seen right through her. His words lingered. "Do you know where you are?" For the first time, she truly looked at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The immaculate marble, the eternal flame, and the soldier marching in solemn rhythm. All of it seemed to hold a weight she had ignored. The guard's precision caught her eye. His movements were deliberate, his steps measured to perfection. Elizabeth noticed how the crowd's attention wasn't on her anymore, but on the ceremony unfolding before them. Her cheeks burned as whispers around her continued. She could feel the judgment, sharper than she was used to. The man, still standing nearby, gestured to the side of the tomb. "Step away, please," he said firmly. His tone wasn't cruel, but it left no room for argument. Elizabeth obeyed, her heels clicking against the stone as she moved to the sidelines. She fidgeted with her phone, unsure of what to do next. For someone who thrived on attention, she suddenly wanted to disappear. Cole didn't follow her but remained nearby, his posture rigid. Others whispered and glanced at her before turning back to the ceremony. The crowd thinned, leaving her almost alone. The guard continued his silent march, seemingly unaffected. Elizabeth glanced at her phone again, her finger hovering over the photos she had taken. She wanted to delete them, but hesitated. A voice in her head whispered she could still salvage this, spin the situation into something meaningful for her followers. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She looked up to see Cole walking toward her. His posture was as straight as ever, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth's stomach churned. "You're still here," he said, his voice carrying no hint of accusation. Elizabeth nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Good," he said. "Maybe you're starting to understand." She bristled slightly. "I get it, okay? I messed up. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful." Cole's gaze didn't waver. "It's not about what you intended. It's about how your actions affect others, how they dishonor the sacrifices made here." Elizabeth looked down at her hands, the defensive edge in her voice fading. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I thought I knew, but I didn't really feel it." Cole's expression softened slightly. "Most people don't, and that's part of the problem." He sat down on a bench nearby, the move surprising her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the moment hung between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Cole broke the silence. "I've seen too many people treat this place like a tourist attraction," he said. "They take pictures, laugh, and move on without a second thought. But this isn't just a place to visit, it's a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Elizabeth asked, her curiosity genuine. Cole looked out at the tomb, his jaw tightening. "Of the cost of freedom, of lives given without recognition. The soldiers buried here, they didn't get parades or medals. They gave everything, and in return, they were forgotten. This tomb is our way of making sure that never happens." Elizabeth swallowed hard, the gravity of his words sinking in. "I've never thought about it like that," she admitted. Cole glanced at her. "Maybe it's time you did." The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation settling over them. Elizabeth found herself looking at the tomb again, this time with different eyes. The marble didn't seem cold anymore. It felt alive with meaning, its silence louder than any words. As the sun dipped lower, Cole stood. "I hope you'll carry this with you," he said, his voice steady but kind. "And I hope you'll think twice about how you use your platform." Elizabeth nodded, unable to find the right words. She watched as he walked away, his figure disappearing among the rows of headstones. Alone again, she stared at the tomb, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. This time, when she reached for her phone, it wasn't to take a picture. Instead, she opened a blank note and began to write. Not captions or hashtags, but her thoughts, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, she wasn't crafting an image. She was trying to understand. Elizabeth couldn't sleep that night. The stillness of her apartment felt oppressive, the silence a stark contrast to the usual buzz of her phone. She had posted nothing since leaving Arlington. Her followers left wondering why she'd gone dark. Normally, she thrived on engagement, but now every notification felt hollow. She replayed the day in her mind, the weight of Staff Sergeant Cole's words, the unflinching way he had spoken to her, and the solemn silence of the tomb of the unknown soldier. She had spent hours staring at the blank note on her phone, trying to articulate what she felt. But how could she describe something she barely understood herself? Determined to make sense of her emotions, Elizabeth began researching. She typed "Tomb of the Unknown Soldier" into her laptop's search bar. Articles, videos, and testimonials flooded her screen. She learned about the Guards' dedication, the rigorous training they underwent, and the stories of the fallen soldiers they honored. One story stood out. A young man from World War II, missing in action, his family's grief compounded by unanswered questions. Decades later, his remains were still unaccounted for. Elizabeth read with a lump in her throat, imagining the heartbreak. For the first time, she began to grasp the tomb's significance. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a promise to remember and honor lives given without recognition. She thought of the photos she had taken, the poses she had struck, and felt a deep pang of shame. The next morning, Elizabeth returned to Arlington. This time, she came alone, her camera left behind. She walked past the rows of headstones, her footsteps light, her head bowed. When she reached the tomb of the unknown soldier, the same guard from the day before was on duty. She stood quietly, watching his precise movements, feeling the gravity of the moment. Staff Sergeant Cole was there too, speaking to a small group of visitors. Elizabeth hesitated, unsure if she should approach him, but something compelled her forward. She waited until he had finished before stepping closer. "I came back," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Cole turned to her, his expression neutral. "I see that." "I've been reading about the tomb," she continued, "about the soldiers who are buried here. I didn't understand before." Cole studied her for a moment before nodding. "Understanding takes time. What matters is that you're trying." Elizabeth hesitated. "I want to do more than try. I want to help people understand, the way you helped me." Cole's gaze softened, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of approval. "Then, start by listening, by learning. This isn't about you, it's about them." His words hit her harder than she expected. She realized how much of her life had been centered on herself, her image, her success, her followers. For the first time, she felt the desire to step outside of that bubble. Elizabeth stayed at the tomb, listening to Cole speak to other visitors, absorbing the stories he shared. She learned about the young soldiers who had given their lives, the families who had never received closure, and the meaning behind the Guards' silent vigil. It wasn't just a duty, it was a sacred act of remembrance. As the sun began to set, Elizabeth thanked Cole and left the cemetery. But this time she didn't feel the need to document the moment. Instead, she carried it with her, a quiet resolve growing in her heart. For the first time in her life, she wanted to use her platform not for herself, but for something bigger. Elizabeth sat in her favorite cafe, her laptop open in front of her. The noise of the busy shop usually energized her, but today it was background static. She had spent the last few days reflecting on her experience at the tomb of the unknown soldier, feeling a nagging pull to act on what she had learned. Her followers deserved better, she thought. They needed to know the depth of what she had seen, the weight of the sacrifice she had only begun to understand. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Normally, she could churn out a post in minutes, carefully crafted to spark engagement. But this time, she wanted to be honest. Vulnerable. Her heart pounded as she typed, the words spilling out in fits and starts. "I went to Arlington Cemetery last week, thinking it would be just another place to visit. I was wrong. It's not just a place. It's a promise, a solemn vow to honor those who gave everything for people they never knew. And I, in my ignorance, disrespected that promise. I was called out by someone who reminded me why it matters, and I'm grateful for that." She paused, reading the words back. They felt heavy, but they also felt right. She continued, describing her encounter with Staff Sergeant Cole, what he had told her about the tomb, and how it had shifted her perspective. As she wrote, tears pricked her eyes. She thought of the stories she had read, the lives lost and unnamed, and the families who still waited for answers. The post wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Elizabeth clicked post and closed her laptop, her hands trembling. She didn't know how her audience would react. Would they see her vulnerability as strength or weakness? Would they even care? The notifications began almost immediately. Comments flooded in, more than she had ever received on any other post. To her surprise, they weren't the shallow remarks she was used to. People shared their own stories, relatives who had served, friends who had been lost, personal experiences with grief and sacrifice. One comment stood out. "Thank you for this. My brother is one of the soldiers who never came home. It means a lot to know people still care." Elizabeth's chest tightened as she read it. For the first time, she felt a connection to her followers that went beyond likes and shares. She spent hours responding to comments, engaging in conversations that felt real. Each interaction deepened her resolve to keep learning, to keep sharing what she had discovered. Over the next few days, Elizabeth dove deeper into her research. She read books, watched documentaries, and even reached out to veterans organizations. She began crafting a series of posts, not about herself but about the stories of the soldiers who had been lost. She wanted her platform to be a space for remembrance and gratitude, a way to honor the lives that had been sacrificed. Her first post in the series featured the story of the young soldier she had read about, the one whose letters had stopped abruptly during World War II. She included photos of his handwritten notes, provided by a historical archive, and shared the details of his life and service. The post went viral within hours, drawing attention from not just her followers but also organizations dedicated to preserving military history. Elizabeth felt a strange sense of fulfillment, one she had never experienced before. It wasn't about the numbers or the recognition, it was about the impact. She thought of Staff Sergeant Cole and the words he had left her with, "This isn't about you, it's about them." As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth's work took on a life of its own. Her audience grew, not because of her looks or her lifestyle, but because of her message. She realized that for the first time, she wasn't just chasing attention, she was making a difference. Elizabeth's transformation didn't happen overnight, but the seeds planted at Arlington grew stronger each day. Her platform, once filled with curated selfies, became a space for stories that mattered. Weekly, she highlighted a soldier's life, sometimes a known hero, other times an unnamed one. Her posts were steeped in research, written with care. But with the praise came criticism. Some accused her of exploiting tragedy, while others mocked her sudden shift. The harsh comments cut deep, making her question her motives. Was she sincere, or was she chasing redemption? In moments of doubt, Elizabeth turned to Staff Sergeant Cole. She emailed him updates, seeking advice. His replies were brief but steadying. "Focus on the mission," he wrote once. "If you're sincere, it'll show." Encouraged, she pressed on, reaching out to veterans and families of fallen soldiers. Each interview left her humbled. Stories of loss, resilience, and courage reshaped her understanding of war's cost. One widow's story stayed with her, a Marine who believed in protecting not just his country, but the people he loved. "He believed in us," the widow said. Elizabeth shared the Marine's story in a post that went viral. The widow later thanked her. "You've made me feel like he's remembered," she wrote. Those words solidified Elizabeth's resolve. Her mission extended beyond her platform. She volunteered with veterans organizations and raised funds for their causes. Speaking at events terrified her, but she pushed past the fear, thinking of the soldiers who had sacrificed far more. Months later, Elizabeth returned to Arlington, this time to meet Cole. As they walked among the graves, he shared stories of the soldiers buried there. They stopped before a nameless headstone. "This one belonged to someone I knew," he said quietly. "A brave man who deserved to be remembered." Elizabeth felt a lump in her throat. "Do you wonder who he was?" she asked softly. "All the time," Cole replied. "But it's not about who he was. It's about what he stood for. That's what we honor." His words resonated deeply. Elizabeth realized her work wasn't just about telling stories. It was about ensuring they endured. Standing there, she promised herself to never stop listening, learning, and sharing. As she drove away, Arlington's headstones fading in her rearview mirror, Elizabeth felt a peace she'd never known. For the first time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Elizabeth's commitment deepened as months passed. Her platform became a space for remembrance and education, drawing veterans, historians, and families to share their stories. Each post resonated deeply, both with her audience and herself, as she grew to appreciate the complexities of sacrifice. Her dedication caught attention, and she was invited to speak at a major veterans memorial event. At first, she felt unworthy, the email sitting in her inbox as she wrestled with her insecurities. Public speaking terrified her, but she couldn't ignore the opportunity. Cole's words echoed in her mind. Focus on the mission. On the event day, Elizabeth stood backstage, her heart racing. The crowd was larger than expected. Veterans, families of the fallen, and military officials filled the room. When her name was announced, applause rippled through the audience. Swallowing her nerves, she stepped onto the stage. She began hesitantly, recounting her first visit to Arlington and the thoughtless actions that had sparked her transformation. "I came here seeking attention," she confessed, "but I left understanding how small I was in the presence of so much sacrifice." The room fell silent as she spoke from the heart, sharing the lessons she had learned and the stories she had uncovered. By the end of her speech, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Veterans and families approached her afterward, thanking her for giving a voice to sacrifices often overlooked. One elderly man clasped her hand. "You're doing something important," he said, his words deeply validating. Her work expanded beyond social media. She partnered with organizations to produce documentaries, host workshops, and create digital archives. Elizabeth became a bridge between the past and the present, ensuring the stories of the forgotten endured. But the emotional toll was heavy. She often woke at night, haunted by the stories she had heard. One evening, she stared at a photo of a soldier, a 19-year-old who had died in Vietnam. His boyish smile and unrealized dreams overwhelmed her, and she wept. That night, she emailed Cole. "How do you carry all of this?" she asked. His response came swiftly. "You don't carry it alone. You share it. That's how we honor them." Encouraged, Elizabeth decided to visit the families she had corresponded with. Meeting them face-to-face brought the stories to life. One mother, whose son had been lost in Afghanistan, welcomed her into her home. She proudly shared medals, letters, and photos, but admitted her fear that her son would be forgotten. Elizabeth promised that his story would live on, not just in her work, but in the hearts of those who read it. The visit left her drained, yet inspired. Driving away, she reflected on how far she had come since that first day at Arlington. She no longer saw herself as just an influencer or storyteller. She was part of a movement to ensure no sacrifice was forgotten. That night, Elizabeth wrote her most heartfelt post. "Every name, every story, every sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Together, we can ensure no life is forgotten." The post went viral, but this time the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the growing collective of voices joining her in remembrance. Elizabeth finally felt at peace, knowing she had found her purpose. Elizabeth's journey transformed her life. Her platform became a hub for remembrance, attracting people committed to preserving the stories of sacrifice. One day, a retired general reached out inviting her to join a project documenting the stories of soldiers whose names had faded from history. It was a daunting yet meaningful initiative requiring travel, collaboration with historians, and connecting with families. Elizabeth threw herself into the project, visiting cemeteries and poring over archives. Each trip brought her closer to the lives of those who had served. Families welcomed her into their homes, sharing mementos, faded photographs, brittle letters, medals tarnished with time. Each artifact carried a story, and Elizabeth treated each with reverence. One story struck her deeply. Henry Walker, a young soldier whose family had preserved his letters, captured the complexity of duty and fear. His final letter read, "If I don't make it back, tell them I did this because I believed it mattered." Sharing his story resonated widely, sparking thousands of responses from her audience. Messages poured in from people sharing similar stories, reminding Elizabeth why this mission mattered. However, the project wasn't without challenges. The increased visibility brought scrutiny. Critics accused her of exploiting tragedy, while others questioned her qualifications. The backlash stung, but Elizabeth leaned on her growing network of supporters. Cole's advice became her anchor. Stay focused on the mission. Partnering with Dr. Lila Harris, a seasoned historian, Elizabeth learned to piece together fragmented lives into cohesive narratives. Late nights of research forged a deep bond between the two women. Dr. Harris often reminded her, "You've turned something deeply personal into something universal. That's rare." The culmination of their project was a digital archive accessible to the public, ensuring these stories endured. Elizabeth and her team presented the archive at Arlington to military families and officials. Standing near the tomb of the unknown soldier, she reflected on how far she had come. Her first visit, filled with shame and ignorance, had led her here, to a place of meaning and purpose. As she stood by the tomb, Cole placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You've honored them well," he said quietly. Elizabeth nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about them." Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt at peace. She understood that preserving the past wasn't just an act of remembrance, it was a promise to the future. Elizabeth's mission grew beyond anything she had imagined. The digital archive became a cornerstone for remembrance, used by schools, historians, and veterans organizations. She was invited to collaborate on projects that honored the forgotten, each effort deepening her commitment. One of her most meaningful projects involved restoring a neglected cemetery for unknown soldiers. The site had fallen into disrepair, its markers weathered and forgotten. Working with volunteers, Elizabeth helped clean the grounds, repair headstones, and document those buried there. During the project, she met Caleb, a teenager who had lost his father, a veteran. Caleb saw the restoration as a way to honor his dad. His dedication reminded Elizabeth why she started. They worked side by side, planting flags at graves and sharing stories. Caleb told her, "I don't want anyone to feel like my dad did, that his sacrifice didn't matter." Elizabeth's platform brought attention to the restoration, and donations poured in from around the world. Veterans joined the effort, families expressed gratitude, and local officials pledged to maintain the site. By the end, the cemetery had transformed into a place of dignity and honor. But Elizabeth's journey wasn't just about grand gestures. The quiet moments, reading a letter, listening to a family's story, or placing a wreath, held the deepest meaning. She often reflected on how far she had come since her careless actions at Arlington. What had started as a selfish act had turned into a life of purpose. One evening, she revisited her original Arlington post. It had sparked everything, and she marveled at the ripple effect of change. She shared an update with her audience, reflecting on her journey and the people she had met. "I've learned that remembrance isn't just about honoring the past," she wrote. "It's about carrying it forward, ensuring these stories inspire us to be better, to live with purpose, and to never forget the cost of freedom." The response was overwhelming. Her followers shared how they had been inspired to volunteer, research family history, or honor those who served. Elizabeth realized her work had become a movement. She was invited to Washington, D.C. to receive an award for her contributions to veterans advocacy. Standing on stage, she felt the weight of her journey, the shame of her early actions, the lessons learned, and the lives she had touched. When she accepted the award, she said, "This isn't about me. It's about every story we've uncovered, every life we've honored, and every person who now understands the meaning of sacrifice." After the ceremony, she walked to the tomb of the unknown soldier, now a place she visited regularly. The silence felt familiar, comforting. As she stood there, she saw Caleb placing a wreath at the tomb. He looked back and smiled, and Elizabeth felt a sense of fulfillment she couldn't put into words. Cole joined her, his usual stoic demeanor softened. "You've done good work," he said. Elizabeth nodded. "It's not done yet." "No," Cole agreed, "but it's a start." As the sun set over Arlington, Elizabeth felt the peace of knowing she was part of something eternal. The stories she carried weren't just memories. They were lessons, promises, and reminders of the enduring human spirit. Elizabeth's journey had come full circle. What began as a careless visit to Arlington Cemetery had transformed into a lifelong mission of honor, remembrance, and education. She stood once again at the tomb of the unknown soldier, reflecting on the path that had brought her here. Today was different. Elizabeth had been invited to participate in the wreath-laying ceremony, a tradition she now understood deeply. As the guard called for silence, Elizabeth stepped forward, the wreath in her hands. Each step echoed with the lessons she had learned and the stories she carried with her. Placing the wreath at the tomb, she bowed her head in silent reflection. She thought of the lives it symbolized, the countless sacrifices, the grief of families left behind, and the freedoms built on the courage of those who never returned. She whispered a quiet promise to continue honoring them. After the ceremony, Elizabeth wandered the rows of headstones, each one a reminder of the scale of sacrifice. The once daunting silence of Arlington now felt comforting, a sacred connection to the past. Cole joined her, his presence steady as always. "You've done well," he said, his voice calm but filled with pride. Elizabeth turned to him, her expression one of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Cole shook his head. "I just gave you a nudge. You did the rest." They paused at a grave marked simply with the word unknown. Elizabeth knelt, tracing the engraved letters with her fingers. "I don't know their names," she said softly, "but I feel like I know them." "That's the point," Cole replied. "It's not about their names. It's about what they stood for." Elizabeth stood, her resolve deepened. "I'll keep telling their stories." "And that's all they'd ask," Cole said. Over the years, Elizabeth's work continued to grow. Her platform became a movement, inspiring a generation to remember and honor the sacrifices of the past. Schools incorporated her stories into their lessons, communities created new memorials, and the digital archive she helped build became a national resource. But Elizabeth never lost sight of where it all began. Arlington remained her anchor, the place where she had first learned the true cost of freedom. She visited often, sometimes with others, sometimes alone, always leaving with a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, she sat by the tomb as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cemetery in hues of gold and purple. She thought of the person she had been on her first visit, careless, self-centered, and unaware. And she thought of the person she had become, someone who understood the power of remembrance and the responsibility it carried. "Thank you," she whispered, her words carried away on the evening breeze. The tomb stood silent, steadfast, as if acknowledging her gratitude. As Elizabeth walked away, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey wasn't over. It never would be. Remembrance wasn't just a mission. It was a way of life.